All right, so now the next thing I want to do is create an endpoint. I could create an endpoint. Oh no, we want to create an OAuth2.config for your provider. OAuth2.config. And so I'm having a flash of memory. OAuth2, right? We have a type config and it's a struct and it's got all this. And so I want to create an OAuth2, so I'm going to create a type and it's going to be oconfig. oconfig, and it's a struct.
I'm going to stop you here. You don't want to create a new type. You want to create a variable of that type.
Var OAuth. And it's going to be of type OAuth2.config. And do I want to initialize it?
Yep, which means you're going to need the equal sign.
OAuth2 config is equal to OAuth, and I know we don't need that to config. Yes?
Yep.
And I could get rid of this because it'll implicitly figure it out.
Yep.
Okay.
And the other thing I will note, I believe, is that all the functions require pointer receivers.
Wait, what are you pointing at there?
All the functions require pointer receivers, so you should probably make this via an address of.
Okay.
All right.
Okay, so create a OAuth2 config. And that makes sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like we're going to do OAuth2. Here we're in package OAuth2. And you came in here and you thought, new client, that's usually a good place to start. But then you kind of looked around and you maybe went and gandered at the examples.
Yep.
And you did config. And then you saw context background. And one of the first things here is create an OAuth2 config where you're going to do client ID and client secret. Ooh, I could start to populate that at some point, right? So here's this little example. That starts to give me a lot of confidence.
Yeah.
So now we're going to create an endpoint OAuth login. And I'm happy to create an endpoint because this is comfort zone.
So I'm going to add the note, you fill it in with information from hands-on exercise 1.
Oh, so you want me to drop that in?
Yeah.
Okay. And then we'll do that endpoint, OAuth login. And OAuth login, do I want to call this OAuth login / Amazon? Because we might eventually have a couple. And so we could add this in, here, and then these, and your provider, where that stuff in the middle, you put in your provider.
Yep. So that might be better to have before the login, between OAuth and login, instead of at the very end.
OAuth, your provider, login. Yeah, group them.
Yeah, that way it's a little better structured URL-wise.
Dang it, there's a lot to know about this job.
And you doubled up your slashes at the beginning there.
Isn't it http://? Just kidding. And so now I need to add in those values. So am I going to put them in right here?
That's sessions map.
Oh, so that would not be the right place. Do you want me to put them in right here, or do you want me to do that like in the code at this route?
No, you'd want to fill it in at the actual config, which is not that either. That's the user map.
Oh. That's also not the right place to do it, right here.
Yes.
So do it right here.
Yep.
And we have...
Because it's generally pretty static.
We have client ID and client secret. Client ID, and that's going to be equal to that. And client secret, and that's going to be equal to that. And those are not telling me what types they are. String, because it's got quotes around it. And then we have scopes, and we didn't...
Which we didn't see we needed any, so you can leave that as the 0 value.
And endpoint, and we've got those 2 endpoints. I'm just going to copy that. Oh, what the heck.
Which you've got that sub-package Amazon for that.
Endpoint, and it's going to be OAuth2 endpoint, OAuth2.endpoint, and OAuth2.endpoint, and so auth URL. Okay, why is it not liking? Do I need to import something?
No, I think you need to click. It's got highlights. Just click somewhere. So yeah, it had some weird highlights on your thing, so I think the editor was messing up. That's saying you don't have a value for auth URL yet.
And so this one's going to be OAuth to Amazon / Amazon. So it's just going to be Amazon endpoint.
Yep, and so that's for the entire thing. You don't need to go into you don't need to create the OAuth 2 endpoint part yourself.
And it brought that in.
Yep.
And it's not liking it.
Yeah, that's because Amazon endpoint is an OAuth 2 endpoint. So that's the value for endpoint, not the value for auth URL. You don't need to have auth URL. So go look up Amazon endpoint.
Okay. Yep. So package Amazon.
So
And
Amazon.endpoint.
we've got Amazon.endpoint is that. Oh, got it. So all I do is endpoint is Amazon.
Yep.
Endpoint. And that goes away.
Yep.
There.
Yep.
And then that gives me both my endpoints.
Yes.
And that's my auth URL and token URL. And that looks different than.
So yeah, that example had the was filling them in themselves,
Oh,
but
yeah,
you've
yeah,
got
yeah.
if
Yeah.
you've got them, you can use them.
Got it. All right, so that example is right here where it's endpoint is OAuth 2 endpoint, and OAuth 2 endpoint is this deal here where you have that and that, but since it's already created for us here, endpoint, OAuth 2 endpoint, we just use Amazon.endpoint. Got it. Okay. Just need to take a breath.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so the next one is.
So, and you're also going to need one more field in the config that's not in the example.
And that's by looking at the documentation?
Yeah,
or?
just looking at the config struct. It's got config struct has got 5 fields.
Client, client secret, endpoint, redirect URL, and scope. So I'm guessing it's that one.
Yeah.
You already said no on the other one.
Yep.
And I don't want to put it in my sessions or DB. I'll put, and just, all right, yeah, that is keeping them in order. And redirect URL. And so here I have my notes. And the redirect URL.
Redirect
so
URL
I've got
is.
my client ID. Let's get these in there.
Yeah, just fill those in.
And it's Amazon 1. We'll just keep going for what we've got.
Mm-hmm.
Client ID, and then we also have, client secret, and then we have Amazon endpoint, and then the redirect URL. So when I think about this process, somebody comes to my website, they click login with Amazon, it's going to go to an endpoint, and that endpoint will be for an auth URL, right?
Yep.
So it's going to go there, and then it's going to, send back some information.
Yep.
What comes back from auth URL?
The code.
It's
an auth code.
Auth code, and then I give
And-
that auth code to this with some verification that I am who I am, and I get
Yeah.
a token,
Yes.
and the client is who the client is.
Yep.
And
So-
go ahead.
Yeah, so the redirect URL is when the auth URL goes back to you, where does it go back to?
Oh, good. And so when auth URL comes back to me, where does it go back to?
Yep.
And so we have that in our notes here.
Yeah, from
and-
hands-on exercise 1 has that. If the provider wants a redirect URL, set it to that.
Okay. So that'll be my redirect URL.
Yep.
And yes,
Yes.
and string.
All right, and that's your config.
Let's put in, fill out the config, fill it in with information from hands-on exercise number 1, client ID, client secret, and then we did endpoint, right?
Yep.
Endpoints, and those endpoints are going to be, auth URL and token URL, right?
Yep.
And then also redirect URL, and that's going to be this. Yep.
Yep.
All right.
Yep. And then if you've got any scopes, you would also fill them in here. So
Okay.
most of the time you shouldn't for just a login thing, but if you do, then you would also put that in there.